yes, without any further delay, I would say I pass the stage to Alex for introducing our fantastic speakers and the topic of today.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. First, I'm going to share my screen first. Okay, so I assume that you can see my screen now. Okay, so first, I'd like to introduce what about today's talk and then panel discussion. And let you know about what will be the agenda. And then I'm going to talk about what we are going to plan, especially that we have 3 distinguished speakers today. So each one will have their own presentation talk. And then after that, we'll get together for the panel discussion. Okay, so first, today's topic is, fantastic, climate risk management. Yeah, it's a hard issue, especially for the United States, because recently the SEC, the regulator, announced that they proposed like a regulation related to climate change risk management for each company. So all of the topic today we are going to talk about will be like a better relevance to that new proposed law. So I think that it is a timely subject that with that the very, very important topic. Okay, so we are going to looking at the agenda is for example is what is climate change risk? There are several types of as you know, it's like a transient or the physical or there is so we are going to be looking at what is the climate risk and then especially how we mitigate them. And then also like can we actually quantify? Most of the climate change risk management is qualitative, and so it's very to do some like organization is better to deal with that climate change risk. So we are going to talk about some quantification and then also strategy, that whether it's a top down or bottom up. So whether it's better for the climate change management. And also we are looking at what are the climate change opportunities, not just risk. They will provide some opportunities. So we are going to looking at the opportunities. And then and especially for the carbon accounting is an important issue, like how you can actually measure and then disclose it. And then is there any like automation solution for that? And the most importantly, financial impact of the climate change risk and opportunities, right? Because financial impact is very important. So we fortunately we have a well-known expert in this field. So we feel that how you can actually looking at the financial impact of the climate change risk. And then also we are looking for the decarbonisation net zero strategy. Okay, so I'm not going to introduce detail about it because each speakers have their own time, so they can introduce themselves in detail. But as you see that we have 3 distinguished speakers, Greg and Joao and Mark, so they will have their individual discussion time and they have their own like expertise in their field. So they will share their experience, ideas about the climate change risk management today. Okay, so I'm going to set the stage to introduce you what the scope of the climate change risk management. So I will going to, for example, okay, so for the first screen. So I just set the stage that what is the imperative about climate change risk. I'm just pinpoint just the 2, like IPCC, right? Because without any like action, we are going to have a irreversible impact of climate change warning, right? Because climate change affected our life in day life and environment, every aspect, you know. So it's a global effort there is going on, especially the United States. We have like the companies to disclose how climate change is affecting them. So we have like a global effort. And also we recognize how we can mitigate based on their individual industry, how they emit carbon emissions. And then I'm assuming that Laura already shared this chart. So this is very detailed. I'm gonna summarize in 1 page what is meant by the climate change risk management. So I just borrow from TCFD. And then you may know that the TCFD also like is adopted by the SEC. So if you look at the proposed rule by the SEC, most of the terminologies and most of the content there is in parallel in line with the TCFD. So I choose this one. So basic component is you need to identify what is a climate risk. So you need to identify whether it's physical, whether it's a transient, particularly is depending on your industry and your business. So you should be looking at that one. And then first, and then what will happen like in the future, like or if you so that's usually climate change scenarios. So there are many entities looking at the like if what happened, like if something happened in the over the couple of decade, and then what will happen. So they have a good scenario. And then the how we can manage the climate change is through the like reduce carbon, so decarbonization, and then some scenario depending on our effort. So happy situation is we want to be reduced our like temperature, global temperature like 1.5 above the like pre-industrial level by the year 2050. And then based on the whatever our effort will be the different scenarios and what it is according to the scenarios, we're looking at it. And actually how you manage it. So you manually manage it through your like effort, everyday effort, like how you reduce carbon, and then how you manage your business practice, something like that. And then also like then based on that, actually you implement your strategy and then you program, and then you turn into program as like a climate change risk management over your company or your institution. And then also there is a good reference like SBTI is a neutral standard, is a science-based transition model that they provide like how you actually based on science that how you can reduce, how you can make your roadmap to like transition to the like net zero in a certain time. So they provide how you set your roadmap and how your migrations and how you measure your greenhouse gas and something like that. So this is a good reference. So you're looking at the following if you want to make this one. The thing that actually the tool, climate change risk management, and then how you can transition to your carbon neutral is the one actually required from the SEC. So SEC not just require to like reveal what the carbon emission, usually they call scope 1, scope 2, and then also some auxiliary scope 3 for the supply chain. They also want you like disclose how you actually manage your climate change risk, and then also they want to know about actually how you manage it, that all aspect of the climate change relate issues through your like for example annual reporting. So personally, I'm also a lawyer. I'm a New York State attorney. So what this means is that in SEC is usually the ESG and sustainability like professionals, they like to use the term material, but up to now material is not the actual material. So material up to now was business material, right? But now it's legally bounding, because the original definition of material is to be legally bounding. So it's you are duty to disclose, and then you will be responsible whatever you disclose through your like a financial reporting. So this is a very significant difference that you have before, like whenever you manage your climate change and then also your reporting. Even some companies actually voluntarily disclose their like climate change risk management, but the situation will be changing in a few years once the rule will be finalized and effective. Okay, so basically I'm also like a technical guy, so I'm a digital expert. So I for me actually not just for the like a traditional way to mitigate like a climate change risk management, and I'm also looking at whether technology, especially this technology, can have this matter, because should be, for example, all the carbon emission management related data, where the carbon generate and how they will relate to your everyday business practice. So I'm looking at whether digital technologies can have that one. So especially automation of your like process. So there are many ways. For example, the AI, big data. can help you to like for data management. And then they having for the like, for example, climate change risk, you need to looking at the like what the climate change risk environment looks like. They will have you to looking at the like data, like environment data, information, or internal data for you. And also like a scenario is very important because we don't know about what happen in the future. They call uncertainty. We don't know about it. So you need to assume something. So we call scenario. So what if something happen, then how you can do? So you need to scenario building, but scenario building is very time consuming and then very manual. So actually is AI and then the current the digital technologies can help you to build up some part of the climate change risk, like related scenario building. And mostly the risk management solutions, there are a lot of the available, but particularly recently there are many effort for the like having for the climate change risk management, especially for the financial like business digital twins to have it to risk opportunity quantification. So if you can quantify, it can be managed and can be like measured easily. And then also financial impact assessment response automation. It's a dream, but it's early stage, but it happens. So it will be happy to like have you to manage your like climate change risk in a certain way. And then what's the most important, how we actually to GH inventory means that how you can identify where the carbon emission is coming from somewhere, like a carbon emission source in your internally or in your supply chain. And then they looking at the like usually the GH protocol provide some standard, and then they will provide a measurement. And mostly because now I call material means really legally bound. So you might know about the accounting principle that whatever you disclose should be transparent. So transparency can be supported by technology we call blockchain. So blockchain can support you this like a transparency, like a data management. Also like for decarbonization, natural transition management is also enabled through the many different type of the digital technologies can have you. So actually I work this for a long time for this stuff. Okay, so I done the sector stage for my side. I will start my share. And then we are going to starting our individual talk. So I think that Greg will be the person, maybe the starting in our discussion. So Greg, why don't you talk about your topic?
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me share my screen. There we go. Shared screen working, Alex?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, today I'll apologize in advance, and that I'm going to be talking about accounting a bit. I'm both a lawyer like Alex and a certified public accountant. So I worked as an accountant before going to law school. And I started about 20 years ago focusing on the intersection of environmental law and financial reporting, and particularly financial accounting. So some of what I say may not register. I've found over the years, even with the brightest lawyers that I've worked with, once I start talking accounting, their eyes would glaze over. So if something doesn't make sense to you, just use the system to ask a question, and I'll try to clarify later. Let's see here. How do we advance? Okay. So I'm going to be talking to you about a set of analytics that I call carbon quotient climate risk analytics. And I developed these about 2 years ago in response to a request for proposal from the Climate Action 100. At the time, they were looking for help in updating their criteria for climate risk management, particularly for investors. So that was the impetus for this. And I have to say, when I looked at the situation that we're all dealing with, is that we just don't have clear measurements for what we're trying to accomplish. And because we don't have clear measurements, and I think Alex, just as you went through, it's talking about scenario analysis, it's so complicated and many times involve science and assumptions about future policy actions that I found kind of overwhelming. And my experience is that if things are overwhelmingly complicated, it just creates all kinds of opportunity for obfuscation and inaction. So I set out with the goal of trying to come up with some measurements that I thought would kind of serve as something akin to a speedometer in a race car, that it was important to know how fast you're going, not just the design elements of the car. And I thought that what Climate Action 100 was dealing with were primarily the design elements. But what we really care about is getting to net zero to meet the scientific imperatives, to avoid the worst outcomes of physical climate risk. So the important to understand that analytics can work in two ways. One is they're just like a measurement. So carbon quotient is a way to measure something using the principles of accounting, and it serves as a yardstick, sort of just a standard unit of measurement. And I'll give you some details on that in just a little bit. But it can be used for internal decision making by managers at the firm level. But also the outputs of those analytics create essentially a scoreboard. So now you have measurements that can be communicated externally or produced by independent analysts that don't require the cooperation of management. And the purpose of that is accountability. So we're trying to create if we looked at climate risk management as a sense of a game, we need to know the rules of the game, and we need to be able to tell who's winning, to primarily separate the innovators from the laggards, so that we have some idea where to push capital. And that works both at the firm level and at the level of the capital markets. So managing the financial risks of net zero, I wanted to, for a paper that was just published by the GARP Risk Management Institute, I put this carbon quotient analytics into the frame of risk management, which starts with a clear identification of the risk. What is the risk? Because if we don't know what the risk is, we're going to have a hard time assessing it, and much less preparing effective responses to that risk. So I'll walk through the pieces of this in the following slides. I found, and it's perhaps my perspective as an accountant, but I find a lot of confusing discussion around climate risk. And essentially, it's just vague. So physical risk, I think we all get that. Transition risk seems to not get much more defined than market, policy, technology risk. But how does that help? How does that help us actually assess the risk and do anything about it? So the way I think about that is that at the highest level, we have systemic risk. And this is really driving other risks, but I think it's driving transition risk. So what I mean by systemic risk, the European Systemic Risk Board published several years ago, I think 2019, a paper identifying what they called the too late, too sudden scenario. And essentially, this is the scenario, which seems more and more likely with each passing year, is that policymakers, certainly on a global level, just are never able to effectively deal with climate change by doing the most obvious thing, which would be imposing a cost on carbon, or taking other steps that would really be economically painful. So where that leaves the rest of us in the absence of effective policy action is with this transition risk, where we're left thinking, well, governments may act at some point. We don't know when, but at some point there's going to be an inevitable policy response. But in the meantime, innovators are going to be out developing new technologies, and it's clear that market preferences are changing. So consumers will be more and more inclined, say, to buy an electric vehicle than a vehicle with an internal combustion engine over time. So we need to factor all that in. From an accountant's perspective, this leads to something that's pretty easy to understand for accountants, but I think maybe not so much for others, which is what I call impairment risk. And essentially, this is that these emissions aren't coming from nowhere. They don't produce themselves, and they're not produced by revenues. They're produced by assets, physical assets, not intangible assets. But it's kind of an important thing to know that the anthropogenic emissions are coming from property, plant, and equipment that's on the balance sheet of every corporation that produces financial statements. And from a financial standpoint, the biggest concern is that those assets are going to become prematurely worthless and may suffer significant impairments over time until the point that they're actually just producing liabilities. In other words, where their asset value is actually negative. And this is something that we can measure, and we can make with a couple of assumptions. We can do it really quite easily. So in terms of the risk assessment, and Alex talked about this with scenario analysis, and scenario analysis is great, but it tends to be very firm specific. So it's a way of understanding the range of uncertainty in the future, which can open management's view up to realizing that they need to consider broader downside risks and develop risk responses to deal with that. But it's complicated. My personal opinion is it can never be standardized, and it doesn't work well for disclosure. Firms are not going to want to disclose their internal scenario analysis. Carbon quotient analytics are doing something quite different. What the core element of carbon quotient is to price the emissions of a company or an asset based on the assumption that we're at net zero today. In other words, the scenario becomes globally net zero is a legal mandate today. And what does that mean? It means that any firm would be required to pay whatever it costs to remove the emissions that it put into the atmosphere, to remove those, to take them out. So it's an easy way to avoid all the future scenario analysis, and that we just say, well, we got one scenario and it's net zero now. The interesting thing about that is that these assets that are producing the emissions in the first place, they have long lives, not uniformly long. So some firms may have assets, that on average have 5 years of remaining life. Some practically may have 20 or 30 or more. And those assets, if they're continued to be used without being replaced or retrofitted in some way, if they're continued to use the way they have been used, they're going to continue to produce emissions. And accountants can easily calculate the average remaining useful life on an average basis for a corporation. So the key here is to look at the future that has already happened. We have these emission producing assets. They're not going to suddenly stop producing emissions. They're going to continue to do that. And it's those embedded, unrealized emissions that create the impairment risk to the asset. So here's the formula for the carbon quotient ratio, which is one of the core elements of the suite of analytics. And I'll apologize again for the technical nature of this, but let me just explain what it's doing at a high level. We're trying to calculate first of all pricing these emissions, and then we're calculating the remaining useful life of the asset base. And so we're calculating, basically taking last year's emissions, multiplying that by the remaining life of the asset base, and then that becomes and pricing that, by the way, at a dollar amount that could vary. It's really not important if you treat everybody the same, but I typically use $100 a ton. And we calculate then the unrealized carbon expense that's embedded in the asset base and divide that by the carrying value or the book value of the assets. So essentially what that's doing is giving us a ratio that's tying this, the unrealized emissions in the assets to the value of the assets, which gives you a pretty good idea of impairment risk. Now you can do some interesting things with this because there's a, and I'm moving into risk responses now. So for engagement, and this could be both internally engaging, management engaging with itself, or investors engaging with the management of firms they invest in. Now this is a chart that's taken from an analysis of a particular company that it doesn't really matter who it is, but it's showing some interesting things that you can do with this. So one is you need to measure performance over time. It's just critical. You can't look at a single year's performance and draw any significant conclusions from that. So what this, if you think about the data requirements for this, it's really just two things. You need audited financial statements and you need emissions data. You know, emissions data, especially for scope 3, is not universally available, but for firms that are producing fossil, direct engaged in fossil fuel or electric power generation, it's not that difficult for an outside analyst to calculate the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So what this chart is showing is the carbon quotient ratio starting back in 2010 for a company, and then creating the yellow line creates a trajectory towards net zero by 2050, with the green line showing actual carbon quotient data for the past 10 years. And then the dotted line representing a calculated projection, trend line curve going forward. Well, when you consider the options that you have for reducing this carbon quotient ratio, which is what you want to do, ideally producing no emissions and having lots of assets, so you're producing lots of value without producing emissions. There's only so many things that you can do, and this is part of the problem, is that the way that carbon intensive companies are going to deal with this, they got to change their asset base. Well, changing your asset base is like turning an aircraft carrier. I mean, it's not a speedboat. These decisions are enormously risky, they're expensive, and they take time to implement. And all of this is taking place amidst an environment of uncertainty based on what our government's going to do. And you can end up just being paralyzed by that uncertainty. Or again, if you just make assumptions that we're going to set everybody on the same bar, which is net zero today, then we've got a consistent way to compare different firms and a consistent way to compare different investment portfolios, or a way to choose firms for a portfolio that are all appear to be on track to net zero. So a couple of things that you could do with this, you could use the CQ ratio to tilt portfolio weightings based on impairment risk, or you could screen assets based on alignment with net zero. And there's other ways you could use, that investors could use a measurement system like this. And then the benefits, I think, and I've talked about this some previously, we need a way to communicate this risk that is understandable, that's objective, it's transparent, it's reproducible. If folks cannot understand how you arrived at a particular rating or score and they can't reproduce it themselves, why should they trust it? And for accountability, we need a way to measure climate risk of different companies on an apples to apples basis, so that we can objectively distinguish between those who appear to be on track to progress and to net zero and those who clearly are not. So that's the goal here. I will stop with that and just tell you that sources of additional information, if you care to read into this, go to carbonquotient.com, and you could get to a detailed methodology paper there that gives you all the definitions and the formulas. And you might also be interested in reading the GARP Institute paper, which is what I've covered here today. Okay, Alex, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Greg. I think that your way to measure the unrealized carbon is very important topic. For example, that if the SEC rule will be like the effective, actually the accounting for the, like, for example, now is a voluntary, it's not the liability. So there may be the cost to do the risk management, but in the future, if it's legally bound, it can be liability in the final statement, right? So to measure some financial like a liability, that you need to make the future liability through your asset and the discount for the net present value discount. So I think that your way to measure will be a very good way to measure liability. So I didn't know that the kind of the good method is better, but I think that that will be good news for the companies especially in the United States to whether they actually how much they're actually liable if they're not doing anything for that kind of carbon emission management, right? So I thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex.
Okay,
I think that's exactly right. We can hold people accountable for what they say they're going to do in the future by actually measuring it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Joao, it's now your turn.
Unmute. And thank you, Alex. Thank you, Greg, for the presentation, and above all, thank you for the audience that is here. And it's nice to share some thoughts on the system, on the subject. So very quickly, I will share my screen and pass to my presentation. Okay, here. And can you please confirm that everybody is seeing the presentation? Perfect. Okay, thank you so much. So, our great presentation was very up to the point. It's great to have a slightly different view of this subject. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is João Llorente. I'm a long-time consultant on information systems, and my goal here is to make for some time now, I've been making the bridge between information systems and the ESG and the climate management. So I will have a light approach on this, and I will start sharing with you that something that we already know. All the planet is being subject to very extreme events. Floods in Australia and in Western Europe, as it is my case, drought and all the derived risks like forest fires, which are becoming very, very tough in the last years. So I believe that I've shared the wrong screen. Let me. Okay, this is the right presentation. My apologies for this. Okay, that is the point where I wanted to start. Is by, okay, we all hear the news about the extreme climate events, but this graphic from Climate Central shows a trend on the increasing and an increasing frequency of extreme climate events. Okay, the media presence on this subject is quite important as it raises awareness. But on the other hand, we should also consider that as we see more and more by the day news on extreme climate events, there is the risk that we can normalize it. Okay, so also important is the previous week interview by Madam Georgieva, the IMF managing director, and she stated very clearly that climate-related risks will impair the economic growth, namely in the Middle East and Central Asia, that we have 7 million people displaced on average year, and 2 billion in physical damage, direct physical damage. The temperatures in the region has risen more than the average growth temperature. I personally believe that we have been up globally than the 1.5 centigrade degrees. There are many scholars that has that opinion, and I honestly think that there is a big probability that is being true. So net zero, the net zero imperative now, it makes all the good sense. So my goal here is to basically to establish the bridge between climate risk management, the climate risk awareness and ESG, and the need to properly manage information, because as we know, there is a huge demand by investors, lenders, insurers, underwriters to have information, to have clear information, to have reliable information on how organizations deal with those risks. Just very briefly, we know that there are two types of climate risk, and one is a derived. Mark already addressed the transition risk. We are talking about extreme weather. Here in my region, and in Portugal, we've been dealing in the last years with heat waves, with drought, with desertification, and our coastal line is being degraded by the year due to very heavy storms during the winter. So this is a direct impact. But as I noticed previously, as the media bombed us with 24-hour news, sometimes people get a little bit relaxed about the subject. Transition risk is from my standpoint a very important one, especially if you have a fragile macroeconomic context, and it's basically about the future and present legal risks, market changes, and the need to adapt very quickly to European regulation that sometimes makes sense for some countries, but considering the economic situations of other countries, it will make competition even harder. On the other hand, there are the policy and the politics actions that will try to constrain moves that affect climate change. That is, before those very recent geostrategic events in Europe, climate risk was on the news. I wouldn't say daily, but weekly, and it's being politicized and sometimes it gives an idea that there are goals that need to be achieved immediately, and and sometimes politicians lose a little bit sight of the reality. On the other hand, politicians are unlike the CEOs and the CFOs. They need popular support, and with those very high-end goals, sometimes there is the strong possibility of losing these support, this popular support. The main impacts, well, the first one, it's I think one of the most important, is the disruptions of the supply chain. The change in demand of goods and services, the more educated and the more affluent consumers now have the ability and the will to select, brands and companies that are seen as more climate friendly. And
Phil,
hello, yes, okay. Um, and another derived risk is the new stakeholder demands. That is, we are seeing more and more activism by stakeholders and by shareholders. Okay, why are those aspects critical to business reliance, to business to business resilience? Because you need to trust your supply chain. You need to keep alive your potentially stranded assets. And Greg once again went to the point of the stranded assets, and that will be a threat for medium-sized and even small-sized companies. Capital costs will also increase if you are not seen as having a responsible ESG approach. And climate climate simply affect a very simple aspect, which is employee productivity. I can see that a lot in the Iberia Peninsula, namely with the extreme heat. Okay, so how should we manage in the very high level? Identify the business priorities, identify the way that extreme climate events, being those slow events, being those very extreme events, how they are able to impact each priority and disable the achievement of that priorities. Then you need to identify assets, vulnerability, and geographical areas where you find that there is more risk to achieve those priority and develop mitigation assets. But one step that is key is to estimate, okay, what are the costs if we do business as usual? What are the costs of a major action? Okay, we are talking about the opportunity costs. And after you have an improved situational awareness, that's what we intend to do in the previous sentences. We need to work as a team, and with a team. Okay, not sometimes the ESG department, the ESG people, they work in a very closed circuit. They need to involve with the rest of the organization, and so managing risk has to be seen as integrated on the corporate risk management, on the corporate management infrastructure. The team involved on managing climate risks or ESG risks, focused on the E of ESG. Of course, they need to have the sponsorship of the team, but people that comes from below, namely system owners and users, but also very importantly the external stakeholders. And I will focus on the academia. Academics are a silo of knowledge, and sometimes that knowledge it's not mapped into the economy, so there is a potential loss of value. Of course, the specialists, and of course the local communities where the organization operates. Okay, and one advice that I would like to share is that, okay, if you are in an organization and you're starting to work on ESG matters, on climate risk matters, get ready for the reaction, because you will need time, you will need resources, you will need company-wide cooperations with very different internal stakeholders. Of course, you will need problem-solving, analytical competences, and I will add diplomacy. You need to have some diplomatic competences, because, well, dealing with the climate risks always imply increasing at least in the short term, increasing capex and OPEX, because dealing specifically with climate risks, it's mostly about infrastructure, and that mitigation process is a capital intensive. So get ready for the reaction, because you will be demanding more resources, and you will need to translate that those costs into benefits, and benefits measured in US dollars. There is always a way. Is that okay? You will need to show how those resilience measures can lead to long-term cost savings, and that is very important for a wise management team. As Greg, I will also use the diagram from TCFD. That's from my standpoint, and I didn't. I went through a simple approach to this that systematized quite well you know, the panorama on climate risk management. On the transition risks, we have touched about policy and legal, about reputation. Reputation is becoming very important. Apologies. Not only because of not only because of consumers, but mostly because of investors. So not only public relations, but also investor relations. But there are opportunities, and you know, uh, increases in when we deal with the mitigation of climate related risks, we almost always go through the gain of efficiency in our business processes. Energy sources are also key, and on the other hand, that appetite from some consumers to choose brands and companies that are seen as friends of the environment, or ESG, if I may. Um, they allow us the opportunity to create new products, to create new business and new business models. And of course, resilience is the biggest opportunity, because in the long term, the firm looks to be, continuous, and to deliver value to shareholders in the perpetuity. About opportunities, I found very interesting to see, okay, where is the money going? And it's quite interesting. 21, globally, there has been issued 500 billion US dollars on green bonds. We are expecting the climate bond initiative is expecting 1 trillion this year, but we need to note that according to McKinsey, we will need 6.5 trillion added in investment every year to achieve net zero by 2050. Okay, very interesting when we look at this graph on the right, that most of investment goes into transportation, to energy, and into buildings, that is energy efficient buildings. So usage, resource usage and efficiency, streamlining the distribution processes, making buildings more effective, delivering machinery more effective and less energy consuming will add up, and it's an opportunity for the company to improve the business, the bottom line. Um, and also, of course, water. Water is sometimes is forgotten, and I'm very sensitive to the issue, because here in Portugal we are under a very severe drought. There is no water underground, and also waste management. So, climate change, climate risk management always helps to improve efficiency. About energy sources, we are seeing the trend of decentralized energy production. Okay, the energy the energy production costs derived from alternative sources like the wind or the sun are becoming more and more competitive, and as they as we all unfortunately know, energy prices are becoming very, very high. In the spot market, for instance, in Europe, since the beginning of the year, it increases the natural gas spot increased 6 times, that is 600%. So the usage of alternative energy sources for the countries that have the good luck of having lots of sun during the year, it's a very interesting approach. But of course, we are talking about having the need of having capital to do this. One thing for me on the financial impact level, I have the conviction, unfortunately, that the markets will not be able to self-regulate, and by policy reasons and politics reasons, I see a carbon tax as almost inevitable. Or the only the only way to avoid a carbon tax, from my standpoint, from my humble standpoint, is to scale up dramatically the carbon offsetting markets, namely the voluntary carbon markets. Otherwise, we will have the taxman knocking at the door, and that will impact revenues. On the other hand, expenditures. I really believe that companies need to have a very light and very flexible cost structure, and needs to be able to show that cost structure to the shareholders, to future investors, because those who have the most flexible cost structure, will be the ones that are more able to deal with climate risks. So just as a conclusion, there is the need to increase awareness on risk and impact, and we need to measure it in US dollars or euros, as you prefer, but it needs to be clearly monetized. I understand that it's very complex to assess the price or the costs, or the cost of the externality, and the cost of of repatriating that externality. I believe that if you have an efficient information systems that allows you to assess your progress and the accuracy of your estimates, as the time goes by, you will be more capable of doing accurate estimates. There is the need to establish the future cost of keeping business as usual, and you need to be innovative, looking for new opportunities. The last point that I would like to underline is that the need for information systems in order to manage all the information. If we just get the E from ESG, we are talking about very complex information systems. Okay, there are some offerings in the market. What I see is that first, they are monolithical. They are not adapted to the structure of the companies, because each company has its own processes, its own ways of working, its own goals. So what I see is that the solutions are monolithical, and what I've also found is that we have large companies, even by European standards, that are managing non-financial risks based on a bunch of Excel worksheets, highly dependent on the voluntarism of persons and the employees that wear the shirt, as you say here in Portugal, and work a lot and work very, very hard in order to manage risks, and above all to report it. And finally, on information systems, what I see is that the market is offering reporting solutions and not decision support solutions. And what most of the companies that do not engage in greenwashing, that those companies that see as a real concern the climate preservation and the management of non-financial risks, is that they need decision support tools like Alex talked, the ability to see, okay, if I take this decision, what will be the impact? And the great suppliers, the great information solution suppliers of this world, they are they are looking for the cash cow that is pure reporting. And with this I end the presentation. I hope that it's been useful, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Joao. I think that your presentation is very important aspect because, for example, that the TCFD have a guideline that actually encourage each individual company disclose their how their climate change and opportunity management onto their financial effect, especially but they surveyed a lot of company and then nearly zero actually report the financial impact of this kind of the climate change, the non-financial factors. I think that the difficulty is to there are many factors actually can contribute to your financial result, not just for the non-financial climate changes. So they have a difficulty to pinpoint which portion will be really contribute to your financial from this climate change risk. So that's a hard issue. And then I think that you give the very good insight about that. Thank you about that. Okay, so finally,
Thank you.
Mark, is it your turn?
Sure. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Let me start out by saying that I'm going to be a bit heretical here in terms of approaching this as compared to Greg and Joao. I did work on the first carbon footprints 30 years ago and helped develop the first greenhouse gas protocol. So I've been involved in these issues for quite a while, but I am fundamentally, at the end of the day, focused on climate change and mitigating climate change. And so I tend to come at all of this through the lens of, are we moving deck chairs around on the Titanic? Are we counting angels on the head of a pin? Or are we setting up systems that actually contribute to climate change mitigation? And so I come at the topic of business climate risk, which I've worked with now for decades, and I'm asking that question in addition to, if we don't mitigate climate change, then we're not mitigating business risk at the end of the day. So let me run through quickly some basic points here. As we talk about risk, clearly we have to remember the context that we're looking at it in, that emissions continue to grow pretty much, well, unchecked, but they continue to grow. Temperatures are growing by one serious estimate. 3.5 degrees centigrade average global change is the best we may be able to do. And so, this situation is not good when we're thinking about a risk perspective. It's also, you can't talk about climate risk and climate risk management without understanding the psychology of climate change. And this quote from Margaret Heffernan is one of the best quotes that I've ever found to explain why we are where we are when it comes to climate change, climate risk perception, et cetera, that the forces of willful blindness come together like synchronized swimmers in a spectacular water ballet. And that's just a very powerful way of explaining not only why we are where we are today, but why it's so difficult to get anywhere else, and why we can't assume that we're going to necessarily, rapidly transition to net zero or anything like that. And again, just from a psychological standpoint, because it's so important, we're fighting against so much psychological and other inertia here that we have to bear this kind of stuff in mind. We have a very hard time psychologically of even recognizing climate risk, much less acting on it. What does climate risk look like? This is not a diagram of climate risk. This is a diagram that was put together during the Afghanistan conflict, and it was subject, PA Consulting put it together. And of course, it was subject to a lot of derision, and people were saying, if we could understand this diagram, we could actually solve the problem. And people made fun of this diagram. But when we talk about climate risk, we have to recognize this is sort of what climate risk is. we're talking about first order, second order, third order impacts. We're talking about big uncertainties. We're talking about feedbacks. We're talking about physical risk, transition risk, systemic risk, policy risk. It is not something, there is no secret sauce for what you see on this diagram, and there is really no secret sauce for climate risk. It's very tempting to find a secret sauce or to find some simple way of representing all of this. But when you do that, you are inevitably leaving most of the risk on the table. Another way of sort of thinking about this is from a more conventional long tail probability distribution. And we tend to really focus, and the IPCC tends to really focus on the quote unquote expected risk, which is right when it comes to climate change is pretty optimistic. Most of the actual business risk is out in the tail, and you've got sort of the gray rhino outcomes. If you've read that book, the gray rhino book about business decision making, farther out you have the black swan events. But even though most of the risk is out in that tail, because it's out in that tail, it's very easy to ignore. And we tend to ignore where most of the risk actually is, and we do that at our peril. George Bacchus, one of the smartest risk people that I've come across, recently retired from Sandia National Labs, makes the point that uncertainty equals risk when it comes to climate change. And so you have to really be factoring in the fact that a lot of the risk is in that long tail of the probability distribution, especially given the fact that we're only going to have one roll of the dice. You can't flip a coin 100 times and sort of know that it'll come up 50-50. You have one roll of the planetary dice when it comes to climate change, and it could go against us, it could go for us in terms of some of those uncertainties, but there is no planet B to go back to. And so dealing with uncertainty and recognizing the risk of uncertainty really is key, but we tend not to do it very much, especially because we're focused, for the most part, we're using IPCC data. And for a whole series of reasons, the IPCC is not seen as a great risk communication entity. And I've been an author for the IPCC, and people work very hard on the IPCC reports, but there are some structural issues that interfere with using the IPCC as a source of business data for risk assessment, not the least of which is that it's substantially out of date by definition. Reports coming out every 5 to 7 years, and everything has to be peer reviewed. It in some ways, saying you have to rely on the IPCC data is sort of similar to saying that companies shouldn't be taking the Ukraine war into account until 2027. They shouldn't start building it into their decision making until 2027, which would be silly. And it's sort of similar with the IPCC. There is so much out there that isn't in the IPCC reports, especially a focus on the long tail of the probability distribution, because that would come across as alarmist, and the IPCC does not want to come across as alarmist. What we tend to do with business climate risk in particular is turn it into an accounting challenge. And I think there's plenty of places for that, and I can certainly see a role for the carbon quotient, et cetera. But if we turn everything into an accounting challenge, if we downscale the global models to figure out what the corporate risk is, if we reduce societal emissions to company level emissions and say that if a company is reducing its emissions, it's reducing its risk, that's just not true. And so we fall real prey to the fallacy of reduction in a lot of these things. And assuming that by reducing your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, that reduces your climate risk could be true for some very specific scenarios of risk, but it is totally untrue for most of the risk picture that a company is facing. And yet we fall into that pattern. In some ways, I think that a lot of the risk assessment and stress testing that we see, it looks great, it feels great, sounds great, but using the words of van der Huygen, who wrote one of the great sort of books on scenario planning, there is this big unarticulated issue that existing management thinking just can't get at. And I would suggest that that's climate change, and that a lot of the things that we're focusing on sort of divert us from the fact that there is this big unarticulated issue sitting out there. Systemic risk is the business risk elephant in the room. And I'm using systemic risk in a very different way than Greg did in his presentation. Systemic risk is the fact that you might be resilient in the sense of that house, but does it really matter that you're resilient if the entire system has collapsed around you? And that is what systemic risk is. And that is, there is very little way for individual companies to hedge against systemic risk, and we don't take that into account nearly enough. In terms of what is the secret sauce for helping companies sort of understand where the risk really is, for a series of reasons, I would suggest that it's not scenario planning. I do climate risk scenario planning. It's a great tool. It can be misused and it can be misleading. Richard Thaler, Nobel Prize in Behavioral Economics, has said that he thinks the most underutilized risk management tool out there is what he calls pre-mortems. And instead of doing a post-mortem to explain why we failed to address climate change and why the company failed 15 years from now, do a pre-mortem now to explain why the company failed 15 years ago or succeeded. It doesn't have to be negative, it can be positive. And psychologically, that's a much more powerful way of influencing your decision-making than having 25 different scenarios in front of you, even if you've done a good job of figuring out what those scenarios might be. So that if there's a secret sauce for helping companies really come to grips with their climate risk, I would suggest doing pre-mortems. At the end of the day, and Joao talked about this a little bit, the idea that companies can reduce their risk and manage their risk without public policy, without a carbon price, et cetera, is fanciful. We can't get to net zero without public policy, not going to happen. And so there's a fundamental problem here that companies are all saying we need to get to net zero, but we're not going to promote and encourage public policy. In fact, in many cases, we're going to oppose public policy. And the idea that, again, the fallacy of reduction, the idea that net zero means individual companies or some relatively small number of individual companies should go to net zero, as opposed to the goal of net zero is to promote societal net zero. How that idea, I know how that idea got started. It was a terrible idea. And it has reduced the conversations in many cases to counting angels on the head of a pin, as opposed to really grappling with how do we tackle climate change? Because at the end of the day, unless we tackle climate change, we cannot mitigate in any significant way business risk, especially over time. And so I'm going to end there so we can have some discussion, a bit heretical perhaps in the context of the conversation, but hopefully thought-provoking. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's also an important point to looking at in the different aspect, especially the scenario planning. That's animal. So, I think that your insight will be helpful to deal with that kind of the uncertainty in the future. Okay, so finally, we are going to have a panel discussion. So we're going to gather together to answer you. So if you have any specific question, and then you can have your question whether you can have put in your question in the chat window, or you can directly ask a question. Is there any question from the participant? Yeah, I think that we have okay.
Is a shy session.
Yeah, because we have two different, but but here is one. Yeah. Okay, so Joe, why don't you have your question? Hi, you are mute. Okay.
Yes, hi. My name is Jose Trinidad Castaneda, and thanks so much for inviting me, Alex. I've really learned a lot in all three presentations so far, but the question that I had for Mark is, we have a situation where there's a massive generational shift, right? We're seeing that the workforce is very young and hasn't had the same access to opportunities to develop their careers in fintech and climate tech, climate risk assessment, ESG. So there's a gap. And I'm wondering, with what you've provided in terms of the context for how institutions move faster towards net zero, move faster towards eliminating their own carbon emissions, what is that accelerator piece that gets a large portion of our young workforce to develop this skill set when, you know, college debt is crippling this generation and the next? It's preventing a lot of people from even thinking about whether or not they're going to continue in an academic career setting versus other kinds of job opportunities. And we have a disconnect with the employers, with the institutions that need these roles filled themselves, in that they ask for 12, 20 years experience in ESG, and the field is relatively new. So I'm wondering if you could help just fill in a gap that I'm seeing in the information that needs to be distributed and spread all over. Is how do we get this workforce going with career opportunities and advancement in ESG?
Well, I think the simple answer, and which is usually the wrong answer, the simple answer is we need to get people much more active in systems thinking, and we need to get a skill that is critically missing in pretty much everybody is knowledge management, because unless we're not managing knowledge around this issue, we can't possibly keep this stuff in our head. And that's what I focus on is climate risk knowledge management. I think from a broader perspective, the metaphor that we use is a metaphor of climate chess, that there is a team urgency, there is a team no urgency, and team no urgency has been winning this game now for several decades. There are hundreds of chess pieces on the board that team urgency could be using, including getting at some of the issues that you're pointing to. But all these chess pieces are sort of running around like chickens without heads. They're not coordinated. There is no strategy. There are no tactics. Every chess piece is out there for itself. And unless we can figure out and make it so that there is some coordination of all of the great initiatives, all of the great ideas, all the great skill sets, if we leave it sort of to Adam Smith's invisible hand for all of these chess pieces to win the game, then no urgency is going to continue winning the game. So there's no simple answer to this, but we need to much more broadly be approaching some of the questions that you're talking about.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a tough question, so I wasn't expecting the encyclopedia.
Thanks, Jules and Mark. Is there any other question?
Hi, this is Silva.
Hi.
I would like to ask Mark about one thing about the climate risk. The climate risk is related to energy. So when it comes to energy, what do we have in terms to balancing the energy needs, which is posing the burning fossil fuel, and there is also alternative fuels coming like new energy, hydrogen. So where do we see this thing is going to achieve in the real world? So that thing I am really looking for.
I think that's a good example of the issue of policy. There's all sorts of studies out there of how we can rapidly transition to 100% renewable energy in most countries around the world. Most of those are engineering studies and optimization studies. And if there's anything we've seen with COVID-19, we are totally incapable of optimizing any response to anything, pretty much. And that's why, you know, there's some good analysis out there suggesting that 3.5 degrees is the best we're going to be able to do when you sort of take into account real world constraints. You know, without carbon pricing of some kind, you know, yes, we didn't leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones, and we're not going to leave you know, the fossil fuel age, so to speak, because we run out of fossil fuels. Unfortunately, we discover more of them all the time. And unless we do something about carbon pricing, there's a lot of analysis that suggests that global collaboration on climate change should have focused not on targets and tons, but on carbon pricing and coordinated carbon pricing. If you know, we will transition to a low carbon economy, but without policy, we'll do it the same day we commit to 5 degrees centigrade. And to accelerate it, we need policies that put into place the carbon prices and the other conditions that make it possible for the many energy sources that are out there to be deployed much more rapidly than is otherwise going to happen.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Sarah. Is there any other question? Okay. Is there anyone? I think that is a harder topic. Is a
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I have a question for Mark. And
Oh.
yeah.
Yeah, Mark is the
Yeah.
one of the the
Yeah, I'm curious. Honestly, Mark, from your standpoint, what do you see as more effective, carbon taxes or carbon offsetting?
I've worked on carbon offsets for 30 years. Carbon offsets are having very little impact. We're doing a terrible job with carbon offsets. And so I'm not sure, carbon offsets could work well, but they can't take the place of a carbon price. But we're not doing carbon offsets well. And so 10 years, we're going to rapidly ramp up the voluntary carbon market. And then people will be writing their PhD dissertations in 10 years about why it totally failed and why 60% of the offsets were bad offsets. So I don't see any way, the only way to get, you know, real carbon offsets is if they are an alternative perhaps to a real carbon price. And so you put in a carbon price and then people either reduce their emissions or they go out and get offsets. But I don't see them at all as one or the other. Carbon, if we don't price carbon, then all of the incentives are for people to come up with cheap, low risk, low quality offsets. So, you know, you have to have, if you're going to use carbon offsets, you also have to be pricing carbon.
Yeah, I think that's a very
Thank you,
important
Mark.
point. Yeah. Thanks, Joao, for that's valuable
Thank
question
you.
and the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Patricia, do you have any question? Can you unmute it? You are now in mute.
Hi, thanks. I'm in the financial sector, so I'm interested, I mean, Mark or Greg, just from, we haven't seen yet harmonization in terms of what the different regulators are doing on climate risk. There's been a number of proposals out for comment. The preference from the banking sector is to keep it as more high level principles and not be too prescriptive. But, you know, the Fed confirmation for the supervision didn't, you know, Raskin had to pull her nomination in part because of her views on climate change. So I'm just interested to hear what you think in terms of the likelihood with the current, you know, Biden administration of having more, you know, formidable policy change.
Greg?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. Let me first say that I agree with everything Mark said. I mean, I think he's dead on. And then my follow up to that is that we all have to get up and do something, right? Try to do something. I think the outlook is quite dire. And I think from the financial standpoint, we've got, the question is, can the capital markets do anything? Do they have any role to play in this at all? And I think the one thing that capital markets do well is they price in future risk. At least they do reasonably well. At least they try. I have very low prospects for unified government action to set a global carbon price, which I think is what is needed. And I just don't see it happening soon. So, but ultimately, that is the big uncertainty for the capital markets, which is to look at this and say, how bad does it have to get before governments react and react in some way that's actually on a unified global basis? If I knew the answer to that, you know, we could solve all the problems in the world, but that is what the capital markets are going to have to do, so that they're not just completely standing on the sidelines. My sense is from banks, they don't want to see their capital requirements raised for this because it directly hurts their profitability. So I think banks are in a situation that they're going to resist strongly any kind of government action that directly affects their profitability. I think on the asset owner, asset management side, it's quite a different game there. It's a marketing game. So how can we attract more resources to invest? So we need some way that sounds smart. And I think what we've got right now is incredibly dumb. So we've got bad public policy and we've got misleading greenwashing going on in the financial markets. I see the most promising, initiative on that front coming out of the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation out of the EU. At least it's directly getting at the issue of financial greenwashing. Because if the capital markets are going to play any constructive role in this, it needs to be based on truth. And right now, that's not what we have. So folks are signing up for their various, funds, trying to do well by doing good, but they're being, I think, largely misled. So, Mark, over to you.
Yeah, let me add a couple of things, Greg. I think I'm all for getting rid of greenwashing. Absolutely. I think that in many cases we're substituting green wishing for green washing, and green wishing is probably a bigger problem today than green washing. The real question from my standpoint, in terms of what Patricia was bringing up, is how do you get from risk disclosure when there's massive uncertainty about future risk? Will we ever be regulated? How do you get from risk disclosure to climate change mitigation, even with the SEC rule, for example? A 500-page rule, everybody has to report their footprints. But if we don't have mandates of any real kind, if we don't have carbon pricing, carbon taxes, whatever, that internalizes the externality, I have no idea how you go from risk disclosure to mitigation, because people will resist it. As long as everybody says, I'm great with climate change mitigation, as long as it doesn't affect my profits at all, then this dog just isn't going to hunt in terms of making progress on this issue. And so I'm certainly sympathetic. We have to remember, when I started working with utilities in this space, 1991, electric utilities in the US, they thought they were going to be regulated by 1995. They thought that their emissions would be regulated by the mid-1990s. And here we are today. So it's very easy to come to the conclusion that we'll never see government policy until something awful happens. But again, right now, the business community, which could push in a big way for policy, is pretty much totally silent and is pretty much totally on the sidelines. And now we're distracting everything with these net zero commitments at the corporate level for companies that are then opposing public policy. And so we need to be focusing much more on the policy footprint of companies than on the carbon footprint of companies, and calling companies out on their policy footprint and seeing if we can't make some progress that way.
Is there any question? I think that greenwashing in the financial institution is also very important topic. I have seen that some in the media that actually the also US SEC or the other relevant regulator actually looking at some in the Wall Street, like a financial institution, like they have like a financial product in the under the name of the like a green, but actually it's not. So yeah, maybe we can some situation looking at that point. I think that the important point actually that relates to that is you mentioned about the resistance from the whether there is a conflict between the like a regulated compliance and then also the really their profitability, right? Because I have a previous webinar actually that looking at the issue about how you can balance between the sustainability and the profitability. So it's always an issue. There was some interesting survey by the Accenture that because they're looking at about the 5,000 executives all over the world, whether why they're doing the ESG and then compliance and management, and then most of the reason is with respect to like regulation opportunity and then other things, but none actually that can have a like whether they can contribute to their profitability. So that's always issue. So it's I think that I circulate that I'm going to have this kind of the talk event, and then a lot of peer actually is nothing to do with this kind of the like climate change risk management. And told me that it'll be huge cost to every company, and then how you actually manage the cost. So we should be looking at whether there are any good strategy and the policy actually the balancing between the like a cost and then also they provide the benefit, and mostly maybe mostly non-financial, but we can also think about they can be related to like profitability. I think that we should think about it. Okay, so I think it's almost time. So if no other question, then I'm going to ask all of you, the three speakers, that this is a Laura's question that I want your insight or comment about regarding the climate change risk management. Is there any secret sauce? So what is your secret sauce about the risk management? So starting from the Greg, just to briefly talk about your like insight or the comment.
I think my insight and contribution to this is that you cannot manage what you don't measure. So I think our fundamental problem is that Mark is addressing, and I think in a very honest way, the global policy challenge. But the fact is we're not solving that one. And so the role of the capital markets has always been based on good information and the ability to measure and to measure financial performance and distinguish between companies that are performing well and those that aren't. So we need, if the capital markets are going to play any role in climate change mitigation, they need good measurements. And right now we don't have them. And we can put out all the data that we want. If you don't know how to make sense of that data, you're not going to change behavior on it. So the role of the capital markets is going to be to reallocate capital. It's a long hope, but the hope would be that the innovators that provide solutions, and that the capital markets can push capital to those innovators and away from the biggest problems. And hopefully we buy enough time with that to get to some global policy actions that don't require us, to have Florida and New York City underwater first. So measurement. People, the human beings, can't take a single step without measuring how far that step is going to go and how fast it's going to take and whether it's going to be a safe landing. We measure everything through cybernetics, and we just are missing any effective way to even have an informed, I think, discussion about measurement in the financial markets on climate change risk.
Thanks, Greg. Joao? You are mute now.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Greg, for the comments, because I will build up on those. And I believe that the challenge and maybe the opportunity to translate that knowledge in actionable information in order to deliver in order to clearly inform decision making at the business level, at the political level, what are the most effective, not necessarily the most nice steps to take, but the most necessary steps to do it. So analytics, from my standpoint, and the ability to forecast are keys. And I must thank Greg and Mark for the brilliant presentations.
Thanks, Joe.
To you, Alex. To you, Alex.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, quickly, I think, again, to juxtapose Greg's, I think, yes, we don't manage what we don't measure, but it's a fallacy to assume that we manage what we measure. And so, we can measure stuff ad infinitum, but that doesn't mean we're actually going to do anything about it. And I think we both agree that companies need to understand what their risk is. The trick here is that their risk, the business risk, is far, far, far greater than you're going to get by trying to reduce it to a financial risk number. And so there's a place for the financial risk number, but unless companies are understanding the big picture risk, which is what a pre-mortem can get at in terms of telling a story about why did we get this so wrong, they're not going to be motivated to actually change behavior. And so we need to be playing chess. We need to be working in several different directions at the same time.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for everyone. Laura, I did my job, so it's now turn to you.
Yes, you did it very well. Thank you very much, Alex. You put together always very interesting panelists that are very complimentary. I learned a lot. My personal takeaway is that, yes, so we cannot take action without measuring, but we cannot measure without the culture that make us ready to measure. So I take the point of managing knowledge, and I invite all participants to share their knowledge with Quigest, which is a non-profit project aiming to map the available knowledge in the sustainability space and facilitate everyone to measure their skills and possibly take action against their skills, so that possibly tomorrow we will have more innovators that make the future more sustainable. So thank you very much for your participation. It was really a very interesting session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you
Have a
very
good time.
much.
Have a great